Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Federation of State Boards of Physical Therapy's April Regulatory Hour. My name is Joni Kalis, and I am a member of the FSBPT Board of Directors, and I'm broadcasting to you today from Lincoln City, Oregon, where we have cloudy skies and a slight drizzle outside. Now, just to get you warmed up for the webinar, how many of you have attended at least one regulatory hour? If so, go ahead and send me a thumbs up or a yes or no in the chat. Now, I'm especially excited for today's presentation entitled Education versus Exam. Not only just because of the provocative title, right, like Godzilla versus King Kong, but this is a topic of particular interest to me. And not only that, this is the first time that I've been lucky enough to be paired up with today's speaker, the man, the myth, the legend, Dale Atkinson. Now, you may not know that Dale received his law degree from Northwestern School of Law in Portland, Oregon. He is the sole managing member of his Northbrook, Illinois law firm, which represents various associations of regulatory boards. Dale is a frequent speaker for FSBPT webinars and regulatory training. Now, a word of warning / advice to the audience. Dale has been known to use the old Socratic method and may call on you to share your experiences and your expertise. Webinars with Dale are a team sport, so stay on your toes. And of course, participants, we want to hear from you. So if you have a question or a comment, don't be shy. Go ahead and throw it in the chat, and we're going to try to be taking questions as they come in. So without further ado, Dale, take it away.
Joni, thank you. From a fellow Oregonian, I no longer live in Oregon, but it's nice to hear about the weather in the great state of Oregon. So thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you to everyone for being on the line today. And I do want to start out by making sure I can advance my slides. First off, I do want to start out by giving a big, sincere thank you, not only to the FSBPT Board of Directors for hosting these, but of course to the staff for operationalizing this. But the biggest thanks goes to each and every one of you regulators who are on the line today for the important role you play in public protection through enforcement and regulation of the profession. And so I will also start out by, so that's a big sincere thank you. And I will emphasize, if you have a question, ask it, type it in the chats, unmute, say something. That's I think the most efficient way for us all to interact and learn from each other. And I'm also going to start out by talking about the title. The versus is really not intended other than to be provocative. It is not intended to pit one against the other. And I think that will become clear through my remarks. So welcome aboard. And as mentioned, we do want you to participate. So your first assignment is to type into the chats where you'd like to be right now, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Camping in some luxury hotel overlooking the city, home sweet home, or perhaps at the FSBPT annual meeting in October coming up in Jacksonville, Florida. This is just to make sure that I know you're listening, you can hear me, and that you can voice some opinions related to all of this. Some people are putting at the beach, and we got a lot of campers there as well. So somebody has to put in the obligatory number 4 there just so we can act like we are looking forward to a meeting, which you should be, obviously, from an educational standpoint. As mentioned, my name is Dale Atkinson. I'll be facilitating, if you will, today's session. I do represent a whole bunch of FSBPT-like organizations, and I've spent my entire career doing that. I only stop on this slide a little bit to allow you to know that there are other FSBPT-like organizations. Many of the issues that you all confront are the same as other professions, and I'm lucky enough to represent a whole bunch of those. So I'm hoping that my 37 plus years of experience dealing with groups like yours will help us and help me facilitate some discussions about what I think is a really important topic today, this exam education components of the licensure process. So as emphasized, this is the objective, if you will, or the write-up about this. So we're going to head down this road of exams and education and delve into some of the important, as mentioned, roles that they play in a licensure process. So I'll start with the FSBPT Model Practice Act to kind of get us going here, to get myself warmed up and otherwise. And so here are your qualifications for licensure. And I don't want to exclude, so I will apologize in advance if assistants or technologists are also included too. I will just refer to physical therapy, but this is all the licensure process of anyone involved in the profession itself. So I will do my best to be inclusive, but when I do talk physical therapy, I'm speaking of assistants as well that exists. So all of you should read your statutes. I'm assuming most of you are regulators. There's probably some educators on the line here as well, academia. But you ought to know what your statute says, okay, and in general. So here's your model act. And if we start with number 2 there, and you can see in order to become licensed as a physical therapist, you've got to meet certain criteria. And number 2 is submit proof of graduation from a professional physical therapy education program accredited by a national accreditation agency approved by the board. So we read that carefully, and we'll see the word accredited right in the middle of that sentence. So what does that mean? We're going to get to that in just a minute, but I stop on keywords. Whenever I read a statute, I read a lot of them. Some are really easy to read. Some are really very difficult to read, but we'll stop on certain words like this. And you notice at the end there, and I don't say all this to be critical of your model act. I say this as issue identifiers for me when I read a practice act, whether it's a model act or a truly enacted statute by a regulatory or by a legislature in a board in a jurisdiction. So it does say accredited by a national accreditation agency approved by the board. Okay, so now we've got the board involved in the process of approving something. So we see the word accredited and approved under sub 2. Now under sub 3, pass a national exam approved by the board. So now I'm going to focus on national. What does that mean? And of course, there's that approved by the board again, indicating some process by which the board, the state board, if you will, is recognizing a particular examination. And in your model act, also, you have this jurisprudence exam potential as well. So passing additional exams required by the board as further established by rule. So your committee who's wrote this is electing now to reference the establishment of a rule related to jurisprudence exams, but perhaps not related to a national exam. And so I only read that just as, there's words in there, and courts will interpret words as having meaning, or the absence of words as also being an indicator of something. So you've got an education piece, you've got an exam piece there, and you can see the rest of the criteria, but we'll focus on those two, the exam and the education pieces of that. So what is happening in the world of regulation, and I see this across professions, this is not unique to either physical therapy or any other professions, is legislators are starting to ask, why is there both education and examination components to licensure eligibility? And we all ought to ask ourselves that as regulators, or anyone else who's on the line today interested in the regulation of physical therapy and assistance and or any profession, is, well, why are there both? This is a very difficult question, I think, to answer in a manner that is not only succinct, but that is understandable by the person who is asking this question. But they serve very different roles. And this is what the rest of today's presentation is going to focus on, is these two components of licensure. But believe me, it is being asked, and it is being asked under the guise of, do we need both? Should we have both? Can we get rid of one of them? Okay. And this is done under a lot of principles that are being addressed by the legislatures. One is just access to the profession, financial growth, unnecessary, what may be deemed to be unnecessary barriers to entry into a particular profession. Other reasons we're asking is the student debt that is undertaken by those going through either an educational and or examination components of the licensure process. And others are scrutinizing the examinations themselves from a standpoint of their psychometric validity, if you will, for purposes of use as an entry-level competence determiner. So there's a lot going on politically that is, I think, making today's topic a very important subject to discuss and to ensure that we all as regulators can articulate an answer to this particular question. So I'm hoping when we get to the end, everyone will have some ideas as to how they might describe why there are these at least two components in addition to the other components that exist. So be thinking about that as it comes up. So what is the role of an educational program? And you all should ask yourselves that. If anybody can write that in a couple of words, put it in the chat or unmute and tell me that. But as we go through the process of determining what is eligible for licensure, and there's somebody knocking on my door, so hang on a minute. So thanks. I don't need any. Sorry about that, everybody. I'm in a hotel right now, and so anyway. So back to the question now: what is an educational program, and what role does it serve? Okay, and how long does it take? How much money does it cost? Tell me a little bit about the admissions process into. Tell me a little bit about the matriculation through and the ultimate graduation from, and what do we accomplish? What is accomplished by persons who wish to enter into that particular educational program? In the world of law, my world, a lot of people go to law school and never become licensed as attorneys. And why is that? Perhaps they see the education as beneficial for purposes of any other career in business or other entrepreneurship that they may be pursuing. Perhaps in your world, it is much more pointed toward a profession, and those that seek an educational program are seeking to become licensed ultimately. But so ask yourself that, what role is this? A lifelong learning issue? This is academic freedom. This is relationships between students and the professors, and all that comes along with a 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6-year education program that can provide a foundational basis for knowledge, one, and two is to help prepare a lifelong learner for entry into and ultimate activities within the profession itself. So however you wish to describe it, and I'm sure there's academicians on the line that would have additional words they would use here, and I'm seeing some of them now: entry-level generalist, critical thinking. There are so many words and phrases that we all should get good at when we are asked the question of what does education do and why is it in the statute itself? And the legislatures who enact the laws may not be able to answer that question either. And they're the ones that have created these responsibilities. So I see a lot of comments coming in. Everyone read those comments and take those seriously, because these are likely, in my mind, educators and others who can better articulate what the role education plays, certainly, than I can. So I appreciate all those comments and welcome continued comments. Okay. So now we say, well, as we saw in the Model Act, to set an accredited program, an accredited educational program, and how are educational programs assessed? Okay. So accreditation, accredited is an interesting word because the accreditation process is voluntary. Educational programs don't have to go through that if they don't want. There may be a credibility issue at stake. There may be also access to student loans and federal funds, depending upon if we're speaking of institutional accreditation versus programmatic and others. But the point of all this is, are these programs being assessed? And we will get to the examinations and how examinations are assessed in several slides from now. But think about that. How are they assessed and what happens? And that's an accreditation process. In general, most educational programs in the profession seek and maintain their accreditation recognition from an accrediting body. And well, what do those accrediting bodies do? Where do they come from? And how are they also recognized? We could start to ask. And I only say this from an educational standpoint, not from a critical standpoint. And I do represent accrediting bodies as well as part of my law practice. So I've already identified a little bit here about programmatic and institutional accreditation. Most in your world, I'm assuming, are dealing with programmatic accreditation, which has a little different, if you will, approach than institutional. So the University of Illinois may seek institutional accreditation, while the program or department of physical therapy or of human medicine or veterinary medicine may seek programmatic accreditation, which is directed to that particular college, if you will, underneath the university umbrella of the institution. So there are two types. Is this important knowledge for you all to have? At least to have some working knowledge that there are two different approaches, if you will, or multiple, I should say, multiple approaches to seeking that accreditation. And I live in the world of programmatic accreditation. Institutional, as I've already mentioned, deals with access to monies, federal funds, and otherwise Pell Grants and student loans. So the accrediting body will have some standards and criteria which they use to assess the program that is seeking recognition or accreditation. Financial issues, facilities, faculty, curriculum, attrition, meaning those that make it through the program and those that don't, and the amount of time that comes up, graduation rates, pass rates on the licensure exams, student knowledge, any assessments or others. And so there's a host of factors in programmatic accreditation that can focus more on, if you will, the content of the program itself, in addition to the wherewithal of that particular program that exists financially, facilities, faculty, and otherwise. So that's where the focus will be. It is not an easy process to become accredited. It is not an inexpensive process to become accredited, but the whole basis behind this is the assessment of that particular program, because it's relied upon within the statute itself as one required criterion necessary to seek licensure in the end. So you could zip through all those. You could read the standards and criteria for the organizations that accredit within your world, either CAPTE or otherwise, and gain some knowledge about the standards that they seek and that they assess on a regular basis. Once accredited, these programs then can seek reaccreditation or continued recognition on a periodic basis. And those vary from profession to profession, but again, that is the manner in which the accrediting body can continue to assess the eligibility of accreditation of the particular program itself. So I stole from the pharmacy standards and criteria that exist here. So I put them in the slide here just to give you an example of the in-depth issues. I purposely chose not to go to the CAPTE route because I'm more involved in the pharmacy side of things and have been, at least in the past. So these are what we're used to seeing, but you can see educational outcomes, structure and process to promote achievement in those particular outcomes. And the focus, of course, is on the student experience and their admissions process right on through to their matriculation, what happens after that. And so these are the remaining 13 standards that exist as well that are looked at. So you can kind of see those. You can certainly try to figure out what they mean, and you could read about them if you chose to. But the bigger picture issue, and within the timeframes we have today, is I wanted to focus on some of these big picture issues that are reviewed by an accrediting entity. And this is what the educational programs go through. They're used to it, and their self-evaluations are extremely important on a periodic basis to assure that they maintain compliance, if you will, excuse me, with these accrediting standards and criteria that exist. So I hear a lot about the United States Department of Education. I'm not sure there's a clear understanding by those that always wish to talk about, well, the role of the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, in the accrediting body and the accreditation process that exists there as well. My short version of the role of the Department of Education is that it focuses on the student experience and the due process rights that are granted to, if you will, due process or fairness process granted to the students related to their experience within the educational program itself. The US DOE does not focus on content-driven issues necessarily about subject matter and curriculum. It is more about the rights of the students that are granted and the process followed by the program itself. So accrediting bodies elect to become recognized by the United States Department of Education. It also is voluntary, just like programs seeking accreditation from the accrediting body is voluntary. So not all choose to do that. And again, there is a credibility issue at stake here, likely for accrediting bodies that wish to be recognized by that Department of Education. So again, this is not downplaying the importance of it. It is more, it's an elected process to go through and undertake. Similar to when an accrediting body is accrediting a program, the accrediting entity also is answerable to the Department of Education if it wishes to be recognized. And it is also up for review on a periodic basis to ensure compliance with the standards set by the United States Department of Education. So periodically, accrediting bodies go before the US DOE and answer questions, provide their self-evaluations and any deficiencies that might have been identified, and then correct those deficiencies as well. The bottom category on this slide right here from the US DOE is time limits to cure. And I have found over the years, with my experiences with accrediting bodies, are that when a program is placed on, say, a probationary status, they are given a certain amount of time to cure the deficiencies. And if they don't cure those, then they perhaps are under threat, if you will. Threat's probably not the best word, but they're under the consideration to lose that accreditation, okay? And the Department of Education steps in here and says, you can only keep programs on probation or under this probationary status for a certain period of time. They have to either fix those deficiencies or lose that accreditation recognition. And so that can become a difficult determination that has to be made by these accrediting bodies to actually remove that recognition, institute the teach out programs, and then these students are left in somewhat of a limbo circumstance potentially under this criteria. So the Department of Education keeps an eye on that. So I know I'm mixing now both the USDOE's role and now the accrediting body's role, but they do play a very important role, similar to the licensure process. If someone does not meet the criteria for licensure, an individual applicant, a board denies it. If an educational program does not meet the standards and criteria of the accrediting body, they are not granted that recognition. Very similar to if a licensee does something wrong and is subject to an adverse action. Similarly, an educational program can also be subjected to the so-called adverse actions as well. And that is everyone's role in this whole process, to maintain the integrity of the licensure process, as well as ultimately the public protection basis behind regulation to begin with. So there's a lot of factors to consider here. And I know I just used a whole lot of words to describe some of that, but again, I think it's worthy knowledge. I hope some of that is sticking. The separating trade from regulation is something that I focus on a lot, not only within the regulatory boards themselves, but within the accreditation process. Again, this next slide, you may or may not agree with this, but the CAPD recognition of the accrediting body is in my mind, as I see it, is under the umbrella of the trade association, the APTA. And these are slides of the bottom first pages of both the APTA and CAPD's websites. And even the privacy policies, when you click on those, are exactly the same. The addresses are the same and otherwise. Now, it's arguable that CAPD is separate and independent, perhaps, but it does fall under this, in my mind, this umbrella of the trade association. I think that's problematic overall. It does exist, and it exists in other professions. This is not the be all end all of what Dale says, but this is what Dale thinks from the standpoint of separating trade from regulation. In my mind, trade should have nothing to do with a required component of licensure eligibility. And while you may argue that these two are separate, CAPD does not file a tax return. I could not file any tax return. It has no corporate status that I could find. So if there is a program that is disgruntled, the lawsuit is going to be filed against the APTA, because the APTA is an entity that does exist. So you can take this for however you want to take this. It's just getting myself back to this slide of, I am a stickler of separating trade from regulation, because the legislatures jump all over these issues, number one, if those two get too close together. And the legal issues also become much more complex when individuals are pressing trade-driven issues on the side of government regulation. That can create a lot of issues that could potentially surface. So take this for what it's worth here. I just wanted to identify this. And by the way, this is not unique to physical therapy. This is also used in other professions. And I would say the exact same thing to any other group that I just said to you all. Now, the last piece about maybe perhaps this education component is the variables that do exist. There are variables that exist on the admissions process. There are variables that exist in the curriculum. There are variables that exist within the application of each course related to the student and the professor. There are variables that address the examinations or other assessments that are done by each educational programs. And then ultimately, all the way in the end, there may be variables in the graduation issues related to those ultimately that were admitted into the program and are seeking to now graduate from. And those variables are quite, I don't know, for lack of a better word, normal, if you will. They have to be there. They just absolutely have to be there, and they should be there. And they are to be applauded and recognized, but they do exist. And there is no simple, straightforward test that can be granted or viewed or looked at related to an accredited educational program. There are variations across the board. They exist. And again, as I mentioned, I applaud those variables, but that does lead to some questions about continued accredited recognition and otherwise. And I don't know if anybody in the chat wants to type this in there. I don't know if there are any unaccredited physical therapy programs in the United States right now. In most professions, there aren't. But if there is a program developing, where does it fall within this whole process of the licensure eligibility criteria that exists? So be thinking about these variables as I roll into the examination portion of our discussions today, and that is these competency measures. Okay, so we can use examinations for short, if you will. I am using different terminology because of some current issues that are confronting a particular client of mine right now, but competency measures, assessment measures, demonstration of competence, however you want to phrase this, but the word examination is a triggering word in today's day and age and the climate and cultures that we're living in. So anyway, so as we move to our competency measures is an added additional, if you will, component that you saw in your model act and you will find in your practice acts. You know, some of them are the 3 E's: education, exam, and maybe experience. In some of the professions I work with, you have to have supervised experience. But so we've talked a little bit about education. We'll talk a little bit about these examinations that exist. Okay. So the first thing I want to say is that examinations are not a capstone to an educational program. They serve a very different role, and they are premised upon a very different process by which the examinations are validated, by which they are able to be legally defended in the event of a challenge, but they are not a capstone to an education program, and they serve a very different role. And that different role they serve is to assess entry-level competence. Okay. And the reason they serve a different role is, one, is because why we have these two components, education and exam. And two is they are built on a platform that allows it, as I've mentioned, to be defended in the event of a challenge, because it is a high stakes licensure examination. High stakes meaning that I must pass that in order to become licensed. If I do not pass that, I will not become licensed. And that's the basis behind which, one, it's considered high stakes, but it's also governmentally imposed. So once government steps in and says you must meet this criteria in order to get a license, and you must have a license in order to lawfully practice, we have to have a process by which this examination can be defended if challenged. And I might ask that same question about the educational components and the accreditation process, but it is not a capstone to an educational program. Otherwise, we would have a lot of glorified review courses around, and that would be it. And so the examinations that my clients use are validated through a process that follows the standards. There's a picture of the book. You all should order it right now and read it tonight. And you'll be riveted with issues related to psychometric issues and other validity and reliability subject matter that allows these exams to be defended. But the very, very short version, and what separates these exams from an educational program, is they are built on a platform of a survey instrument that identifies what it is practitioners do, theoretically on the first day on the job, how often they do it and how important it is. And with that, data is built through that survey instrument. Content areas are identified, and this is a very simplistic view, but for those of you who have not seen this process in action, volunteer to a FSBPT to be involved in their program and watch it in action. It is a fascinating process, and I think you would be not only surprised by it, but you would be impressed by the process that's followed. So survey instrument, data is collected as to what practitioners do on that theoretical day one on the job, if you will. And through that, content areas are identified. And those content areas create the blueprint for the exam itself. Ultimately, item writers write items that populate each of those content areas. And those items go through a rigorous process of not only being written, edited, reviewed, perhaps rewritten otherwise, and they ultimately then are placed on the examination as a pretest item. And a pretest item merely means that it's on there on the exam. The examinees don't know which are pretest items versus which are not. And those pretest items then are scored and statistically analyzed to determine their performance. And if they perform well under psychometric and or statistical principles, they eventually become a scored item. If they don't perform well, they're either eliminated, edited, removed, whatever it takes. And this formal process is what allows this examination, your examination and all the others I work with, to be defended as an entry-level competence determiner because of this entire process. It is quite complex. It is quite rigorous. And in the middle of all that I just described, there's standard setting and others to determine the pass-fail cut score, if you will. And everyone on the line also should, or you probably already know this, but you understand that how far above the cut score is irrelevant. You either pass or you don't. And it is not an indicator of performance, if you will, like an SAT or an LSAT program. It is an indicator of demonstration of entry-level competence used by licensing boards to determine eligibility for licensure. And that is it, if you will. And obviously it's a high stakes important aspect of the licensure process, but it is not based upon a scored issue related to how high above that cut score you actually scored. The other big picture component that identifies these exams is that they're criterion referenced, meaning you are not judged against your peers, you are judged against the standards set. So everyone could pass or everyone could fail. It just depends upon a demonstration of knowledge during that exam administration. So it's kind of a different animal perhaps than we're used to. Many of you I know have heard this before. It's always nice to hear it again. And this is just a very distilled down version of what is a complex process. If Lauren's on the line, make sure you email Lauren and ask him some more questions as well. So the biggest picture issue of these standards is this psychometric process I kind of just described and the whole statistical analysis, but validity, reliability equals legal defensibility in my mind. Validity is the exam tests it's intended to test. That's what that survey instrument does. That's what it's established. That's what establishes that content area. And that validity factor then determines that you are assessing one's competence related to the data created from that survey. So it's a valid measure, if you will, is the terminology that might be used. Reliability just means that persons with similar knowledge, skills, and ability will have similar outcomes on the exam. So to use a unsuccessful exam attempt example, if I take the exam today and I'm unsuccessful, and my score shows that, and I do nothing to increase my knowledge, skills, and abilities, and I take the exam again, I will likely get, if you will, the same score or something very close there too. Putting aside any other factors that might have surfaced because the first time I took it, maybe I had a cold or didn't feel good or whatever happened. So other than that, the demonstration of knowledge, skills, and abilities and the similarities and scores between those with similar knowledge, skills, and abilities is this reliability factor. And these two issues of validity and reliability are what create that legal defensibility. And I'm going to get to the cases here in just a couple of cases in just a minute. And you don't see cases challenging the high stakes licensure exams of the professions, in part because of this rigorous process that is undertaken. And it is difficult to show how an exam is not a valid measure, at least the exams in the world of professional licensure like you all. So keep in mind a little bit about this terminology. Certainly keep in mind now how we have started to distinguish between the educational component and the examination component, and how they are, while they're related, they are not, the exam is not a capstone to that education. Okay. So I've already answered this question, but what are these assessments used in the licensure process measure? And it is entry-level competence. And that's what the government boards, if you will, created legislatively are assessing. It's entry-level competence. It's not advanced competence. It's not specialty certifications or anything else unless the law sets that forth. But this is entry-level competence. And the exams are developed and the cut scores are geared toward this entry-level competence as a basis for determining pass and determining fail. So all of these are factors that help us. I'm hoping all of these words that I'm just kind of throwing around now are factors that help us describe why there is both education and exam components in the licensure process when the legislatures start to ask these questions. So in the context of a licensure process, what do these exams do in part? Okay. In addition to what I've described on the formal side, the reason why FSBPT-like organizations exist, one of the reasons, and all of my clients, is to promote uniformity. So the passing score, if you will, the passing result, I should say, in one jurisdiction is the same in all other jurisdictions. And I remember the day, and I've been doing this a long enough time, when not only did states have different licensure exams, some states that used the same exam had different cut scores. It's hard for me to imagine defending that if it came up, but there was a basis for determining what that cut score should be. So the evolution of the associations of regulatory boards like yours and other clients that I represent is really driven a lot by uniformity. It's an assessment mechanism, and it provides a uniform cut score. So it does a couple of things. One, it relieves the burdens on state government to develop their own exam and go through that entire process we just talked about. But also at the same time, it provides a basis by which if I am licensed in Oregon using our Oregon reference earlier today, and I want to move to Washington, that passing score I received to get my Oregon license can be recognized by Washington to at least address the competence components to the licensure eligibility requirements. So that uniformity is super important, related to mobility and portability issues, endorsements. Some may call that reciprocity, even compacts and others that exist that recognize the basis for the exam itself. It certainly adds efficiencies to state government when it comes to the reliance upon an examination that is validated under the process we just talked about. And I will emphasize that the FSBPT organization and other clients, the membership are made up of the regulatory boards themselves. And so your reliance is really relying on your own program. And we need to get used to the fact of saying this is the so-called our exam. It's not your FSBPT's exam, it's our exam, you being the our regulators. And you have a say in the entire process. So not only does it lead to that efficiency issue, but I think it also it hits more home because it's really your program and it's your examination. So that's a factor probably should be on this slide as well. I refer to the defensibility, the legal defensibility in case there's a challenge to it. And that so-called insurance policy that each member board has is extremely important in the event of the challenge. And I suspect that over the course of the next several years, we will see more issues related to potential challenges to the examination program itself. And so I'm seeing a chat come in here, so I'm kind of trying to navigate the chats as well. I'll read that in just a second. So we'll finish that and just look at the money that this saves too, by the way, from the standpoint of each state having their own exams. And so long as you have confidence in this process, and you should, by the way, and you should attend the FSBPT annual meetings, and you should ask questions about the exam program. But I'm quite confident you will be assured of its defensibility and that you will have an understanding of that as well. So Joni, maybe you can read that longer chat, and if you can formulate that into that question, I'll kind of keep going. But you interrupt me when you're ready on that. Somebody just said, "I'm curious about a view about exams." Well,
I'm ready. I'll read it to you just to make it a little easier for you to answer.
Thank you.
So, I'm curious how you view examinations conducted by academic programs at the end of program that are intended/designed to comprehensively measure entry to practice competence. How would this differ from a licensure exam such as FSBPTs?
All right, so to start that out then, and again, what I'm about to say is not being critical of an academic program. It is being realistic to the view as to what it takes to develop a uniform licensure exam that's used across all the U.S. and most of my clients, it's North American, so it's also provincially recognized as well. And so that process is quite an undertaking to, again, gather that data and go through the statistical analysis and process of item developing and otherwise that I've referred to. One, academic programs, I don't think necessarily need to do that. But I also would say academic programs probably couldn't do that even if they wanted to do that, or their tuition rates would be quite high. It would take quite a bit in order for an academic program to validate an examination program, either nationally or perhaps on a North American basis. However, I would suggest perhaps that capstone examination is a capstone to the academic curriculum rather than potentially the practice. But I admit that there's overlap to that as well. So I think the difference is the development and defense process that would be undertaken by an entry-level competence exam that's high stakes, as opposed to a comprehensive capstone to an academic program. I hope that was responsive to the question, but continue to ask if it isn't. Make sense? All right, so I will and type something in the chat or unmute if someone has something more to say about that. Let me get back to my slide here. Okay, so I might suggest to you and ask you to think about this for just a minute. In the context of a licensure process, a legally defensible examination, as I just described, is really the only licensure criterion that is validated through a process that minimizes the variables and has a basis for being legally defended. There are so many variables in any other process related to the exam. Academic side, the education side, we've talked about admissions, matriculation through, graduation from. There are certainly subjective measures potentially in good moral character assessments, criminal background checks, assessing whether one is fit, if you will, to practice from a moral character or moral turpitude approach, and others. So these variables, by the way, these are not. I'm not saying that as being fatal to the licensure process. I'm saying that flexibility can be very beneficial. The examination is the only piece to a licensure process that is validated through this formality of the standards that we've already talked about. So at least be thinking about that and how that might come into play in your process of describing why there are multiple criteria related to licensure eligibility. So I think this is an important statement to allow it to sink in a little bit and react to that. And so if anybody has any comments about that, feel free to unmute and or type them into the chat, and my chats went back to the top, so I'll go back to the bottom. Okay, so be thinking about that. Be thinking about the defensibility side to that exists. Now, I will say this is not to say that an entry-level competence exam is intended to replace any other criteria. This is also not to say that an educational component is intended to replace any other such criteria. This is a basis by which I'm hoping my remarks and our interactions today are providing us with an understanding of why they are both there and provide us with a basis for which we can perhaps articulate those when necessary and when they do surface. So this is not a replacement issue. This is a recognition of the important roles that they play. So let me give you a couple examples. This happened last year in the state of Illinois, Senate Bill 1632. In the course of approximately, I think it was, I don't know, 4 or 5 months, might have been a little bit longer, but in a short period of time, when it comes to, by the way, legislation was introduced, discussed, read on the floor multiple times, voted on and signed into law that eliminated the licensure exams for social work for baccalaureate and master's social workers. Okay. This happened in, like I said, in a relatively short period of time. And what I'm amazed by is it went through both chambers of the legislature without one single dissenting vote. Not one single dissenting vote against that. So I asked myself, first off, how did this happen? Okay. And, I can say it that way in that shocking, how did this happen way. I mean, it's a political process. I get it. But the board didn't know. Illinois is a departmentalized state. So the boards in the state of Illinois, all the regulatory boards are mere, I guess, maybe, are advisory to the department, the bureaucracy of the department. Nothing is final until the department says that it is. So the board in Illinois, I'm not sure they even knew that this was happening, and it did happen. And so short period of time, eliminate the examinations. So now what? What is being relied upon for purposes of the integrity of the licensure process? Well, the education component, I guess, with all of its pros and cons to that issue. Again, the amazement to me is this bill passed without a single dissenting vote in either chamber of the legislature. So, draw whatever conclusion you wish to draw out of that. But let me wrap up here with just a couple of cases. I'm going to just go through the cases very, very quickly.
Hey, Dale,
yeah,
can I interrupt you really quick? Because we got a discussion in the chat there. There's a question of, the chat's moving so fast. Would a physical kind of test be of any value? And cosmetologists have such a test.
A physical kind of test. So a hands-on clinical test of some sort.
That's how I interpret that as well.
Sure. I mean, when you say that, the question is okay, step back and say, what do the legislatures intend to have measured as a component of licensure eligibility? Okay, so competence of some sort, and must you have this clinical component? Well, first off, the kind of the short answer is, well, that depends on what the statute says, right? So we'll start there. And should the legislatures enact statutes that require this clinical, if you will, portion of it, and it's a very difficult issue to have. So to develop and then defend in the event of a challenge, and to have it administered uniformly across the United States. So could that be overcome? Sure, it probably could be. It would be quite expensive. And if you want a uniform exam, it'd be very expensive, right? And where would you hold these exams, and where would you get those that would so-called grade the clinical experience? So you have to think about all these factors. Or you would say each state is going to do that, and then I would say you would have so many variables you probably wouldn't know where to begin. And two is, if it gets challenged, the state is on its own in defending that. So that's a really good question. And in optometry, they do have a clinical version of their examinations in addition to the written. And candidates have, I believe right now it's maybe 2 test centers. It might be 3. I can't recall offhand. But so now all candidates have to fly to one of those test centers and take this examination. And the reason that is only given at certain number of locations is because they need the uniformity. They need to be able to defend the results drawn from that. So you have trained individuals who are not only acting as those that are assessing the work done, but you have trained so-called patients that are coming in and having their eyes worked on, if you will, as part of that process. So it's a really good question, and it's a difficult one to implement, although it sounds good on paper. But you all would have to decide. I guess the legislatures would ultimately decide whether that is a necessity to achieve the public protection goal in the licensure process. So that's a really good point. I'm glad somebody asked that, because that's that's worthy of discussions and consideration.
Dale, we also have a follow-up question when we were speaking about an exam. Are there other factors beyond the psychometric considerations and sample size that you thought were relevant to this argument?
So the argument of
this goes back to your view on examinations conducted by academic programs at the end of the program.
Right. So again, when you say other factors, I think the other factors to me are the defensibility of the program itself and the fact that it is high stakes, meaning it must be passed. So I'm assuming that the discussion in the exam, and I'm just calling it capstone right now, and you may not mean that, but I'll call it capstone to the education component. If I'm unsuccessful on that, what are the consequences? I don't graduate. I guess I don't meet the education component. So you could call that high stakes as well. But I think the components that I consider when you say are there other factors are those defensibility driven factors that are handled by those standards. So I'm not sure if there would be more beyond that. No, I'm not sure I would consider any other factors related to that, because I stick to that defensibility question side. So, I think that was responsive to the question. If not, keep typing or unmute. So a couple of cases to identify. There are multiple cases. My clients are involved in some in the accreditation world as well. Here, the Court of Appeals reversed the lower court award of a preliminary injunction, meaning the institution here who did not have their recognition renewed, their accreditation renewed, initially got an injunction from the enforcement of that non-renewal, and the Court of Appeals reversed that and said, nope, you're wrong, lower court. The Court of Appeals held that the university failed to establish the likelihood of success in that it had not complied with at least 24 standards. There are a lot of standards at stake here, and the failure to then renew was justified according to the Court of Appeals. It did take, again, as I've mentioned, an appeal on this, and you like to see, maybe not like, but courts that reverse lower courts are more full of information that I benefit from when I read them than perhaps affirmations. But the point being here is if you don't meet the standards, you're not going to have your accreditation recognition either programmatically or institutionally renewed. And this does happen somewhat on a regular basis. I don't want to say overly too much, but you have to continue to have your programs meet the standards. And the last case here is so I had an accreditation case. I wanted to have an examination case. They're very hard to find in the world of high stakes licensure exams. Most of the cases you will see are like this one, that these are promotional exams. So you see them in police departments, you see them in fire departments and others where you want to become promoted to a lieutenant or some other position. And in this particular case, the district court found that the police department promotion exam was unlawfully discriminatory, as that the police department failed to prove that the exam was job related. And this is such an important component. You can have disparate outcomes on a licensure exam, meaning some demographics don't perform as well as the others, so long as the exam is job related. And that's why you go through the survey instruments and otherwise. So there are a lot of cases like this one that deal with employment settings and promotions, and that's a very different animal. There aren't cases on the other side that just challenge the examination as a basis for entry-level competence. And again, as I've mentioned, because the groups, at least that have these high-stakes exams, go through the process of following those standards. It's very hard to overcome those, but there will be challenges I'm kind of predicting here and somewhere in the near future. But so you might see cases that challenge exams. You just need to know that you're distinguishing between employment cases and licensure cases. And those employment cases are going to be under Title VII, some discrimination statutes, and otherwise. The licensure cases are a different animal, and you just don't find those right now. Again, as I mentioned, because of the sophistication and rigorous process that's followed. So my wrap up here a little bit is an emphasis that I am recognizing the important role that all statutorily established criteria play, and the important role of licensure and regulation and public protection ultimately. So while the title talked about education versus exams, it was really intended to identify the roles that each play. And there is overlap, certainly, and there is communication, certainly, between academia and the exam side, and there certainly is curriculum development and otherwise. And the accrediting bodies that I work with also will look at pass rates on the licensure exam as one criterion that they assess related to accreditation and renewal of that. But I just want to emphasize that these are both playing very important roles that exist. So, Joni, are there any other questions, or does anybody want to unmute and say anything? And was this helpful? I hope this was helpful. And did you learn something?
Well, Dale, let me say that thank you so much for this, just a terrific presentation on this very important and highly relevant issue, and just for so eloquently outlining the different purposes of education and the licensure exam. Really appreciated. I loved it.
Yeah, thank you, Dale. I'm Sam. I joined late. I made a comment that, I'm really against academic programs having some do-all, end-all tests at the end of the whole program, and they have a lot of item writers who are writing these tests, and but they don't have the psychometric data analysis to really say these are valid questions that really are make or break. And so, to me, it's a formative test, not a summative test. The state boards are the summative test. They've been through the clinicals, they've done all they can, they've soaked up all the information they can. That's the time to test them, not the end of a program. I've had arguments with people about this. And they say, oh, it helps our pass rates. Well, yeah, maybe it does, but it shouldn't be a high stakes thing that says you can't graduate.
Yeah. But I hear you, and I agree with that. And I have had clients also, by the way, go through issues related to the licensure exams themselves and have harvesting schemes and otherwise where they've had students memorize items and give them back to the programs and others. So yeah, I think it's, I think this intersection, this interlapping, if you will, of the two can be a little bit dangerous at times, but I agree with you on the psychometric side as well.
Yeah, I mean, they've got to put the same amount of testing and time in it that the regular state board people do on. You put 50 test questions on, run them, get the data on them, see if they're valid, all that. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Sam. I can see by the clock behind you, my time's almost up too. So
you're right. Yeah. I'm Eastern Standard.
So I appreciate everyone being on. So I'll say my thanks, but if anybody has anything to say, feel free to do that. But I do want to emphasize, one, thanks to FSBPT for having me on here. But two, the biggest thanks goes to each and every one of you for the role that you play. And again, whether you're in academia and or a regulatory board, you all play very important roles, and the public should be thankful for that. You're not thanked enough, so I will say a big thank you as well.
Thank you so much, Dale. And thank you everyone for attending. We appreciate it. See you next time.
Thank you.